The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet city street. It was the kind of evening where people were just wrapping up their day, heading home, lost in their own thoughts. But for Lisa Carter, what should have been a simple trip to the grocery store turned into something she never saw coming. Lisa was a woman of grace and confidence. Dressed in a sleek navy blue dress, she carried herself with an air of quiet strength. As she walked toward her luxury car, a gleaming black Mercedes parked neatly outside the store, she noticed something unusual. Two uniformed police officers stood beside her vehicle, eyeing it suspiciously. A knot of unease formed in her stomach, but she took a deep breath and approached. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, keeping her tone calm. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, turned to her. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, as if trying to fit her into some expectation he had in his mind. The other officer, a younger man with short cropped hair, shifted uncomfortably. "This car was reported as stolen," the older officer said, crossing his arms. Lisa's eyebrows shot up. "That's impossible. This is my car." She reached into her purse and pulled out her keys, pressing the unlock button. The car's lights blinked in response. "See. Have the keys. I own this car." The younger officer hesitated, but the older one wasn't convinced. "Do you have proof of ownership?" he asked, his voice firm. Lisa opened her purse again, searching for her registration papers. But before she could pull them out, the officer stepped forward, his hand hovering near his holster. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the vehicle," he ordered. A small crowd had started to gather nearby, sensing the tension. Some whispered among themselves, others took out their phones. Lisa could feel their eyes on her, but she refused to let panic take over. "Officer, this is a mistake," she said firmly. "I can show you my paperwork. There's no need for this." But the older officer wasn't budging. He muttered something to his partner before glancing back at Lisa. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, we'll have to impound the vehicle until we can confirm ownership." Lisa's heart pounded. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was humiliating. She knew the truth, yet here she was, being treated like a criminal in front of strangers. She had worked hard to afford this car. Every long night, every sacrifice, every ounce of effort had led to this moment, owning something she was proud of. And now, in just a few minutes, it was being stripped away from her. Then, just as she was about to speak again, she heard the deep, familiar rumble of an engine approaching. A sleek, dark SUV pulled up to the curb, and out stepped a man with a commanding presence. Her husband, dressed in a tailored suit. His expression was unreadable as he took in the scene. His sharp eyes flicked from the officers to Lisa, then to the growing crowd. He calmly closed the car door behind him, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves before taking a slow step forward. The officers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering for the first time. Something about this man's presence made the air shift. He wasn't angry, at least not yet, but there was an undeniable power in the way he carried himself. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice steady. And in that moment everything changed. The street seemed to go quiet for a moment. Even the hum of distant traffic felt muffled as Lisa's husband, Jonathan Carter, stood tall in front of the officers. His presence alone shifted the energy in the air. Calm, composed, yet undeniably firm. Lisa let out a slow breath, relieved but still tense. She knew her husband well enough to recognize that look in his eyes. It wasn't anger, but it was close, something colder, sharper. The kind of look he reserved for situations that demanded control, for moments where words carried weight. The older officer cleared his throat, glancing at his partner before responding. "Sir, we received a report about this vehicle being stolen. We were in the process of verifying ownership." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "And did my wife not already tell you that this is her car?" The officer shifted slightly, as if recalibrating his stance. "She did. But we need proper documentation to confirm that." Without a word, Jonathan reached into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a thin leather wallet. He flipped it open and retrieved a small, neatly folded document before handing it over. The registration. The car is under my wife's name, but I made the purchase. You'll find my signature right there. The younger officer hesitated, taking the paper and glancing over it. The older one, however, seemed less willing to back down. He took the document and studied it carefully, but his face gave away nothing. Lisa watched closely, her heart still racing. She hated that this was happening, that she even needed Jonathan here to validate something that was already clear. But she also knew her husband. He wasn't the type to let things slide. The crowd had grown slightly, quiet murmurs filling the space. A few people had their phones out recording. It wasn't just about the car anymore. People wanted to see how this played out. Jonathan turned his gaze toward Lisa for the first time since arriving. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, though the tightness in her chest hadn't gone away. "I was just coming out of the store when I saw them standing here. They didn't believe me when I said the car was mine." Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line before he turned back to the officers. "Tell me," he said, his voice controlled but firm, "when you received this so-called report, did you bother checking the details? Or did you just see my wife standing next to a luxury car and assume the worst?" The older officer squared his shoulders. "Sir, we're just doing our job." "Are you?" Jonathan challenged, taking a slow step forward. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you were ready to tow my wife's car without even running a proper check. Did you verify the license plate? Cross-check the registration with DMV records before jumping to conclusions?" The younger officer finally spoke up, his voice quieter than before. "We were in the process of doing that when your wife arrived." Jonathan let out a slow breath, his patience thinning. "And now that you have the registration in your hands, what's the problem?" The older officer hesitated, then finally glanced at the paper again. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He didn't want to admit it, but there was nothing left to argue. The information matched. The car was registered under Lisa's name. There was no stolen vehicle, no crime. Lisa could see the realization setting in, but she also saw something else, a flicker of stubborn pride. The officer didn't want to admit he had jumped to the wrong conclusion. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "Everything checks out." He handed the paper back to Jonathan. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Jonathan took the paper, slipping it back into his wallet with precise movements. He didn't say anything right away, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. Then, after a pause, he spoke again. "Inconvenience," he repeated, his voice quiet but edged with something unmistakable. "Is that what you call this?" The officer stiffened slightly, but Jonathan didn't wait for a response. "My wife was humiliated in front of a crowd. She was treated as guilty before she was even given a chance to prove her innocence. You assumed she couldn't own this car before you even checked the facts. So tell me, officer, was this really about a stolen vehicle or something else?" A heavy silence settled over the street. The crowd was still watching, still recording. The older officer's face remained unreadable, but the younger one shifted uncomfortably, as if finally realizing the weight of the situation. Lisa took a small step closer to Jonathan, sliding her hand into his. He squeezed her fingers lightly, a silent reassurance, a shared understanding. The officers exchanged another glance before the older one finally muttered, "We'll be on our way." And just like that, they turned and walked back toward their patrol car. The tension in the air didn't immediately lift, but Lisa felt a small wave of relief wash over her. As the police vehicle pulled away, Jonathan turned to her fully, studying her face. "You sure you're okay?" Lisa exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "I am now," she admitted. Jonathan nodded, then glanced at the small crowd still lingering nearby. A few people were still recording, others whispering amongst themselves. Some looked satisfied, others contemplative. Lisa knew what they were thinking. Some had likely seen situations like this before. Others were witnessing it for the first time. But they had all just seen something unfold that shouldn't have happened in the first place. Jonathan glanced at the car, then back at her. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go home." Lisa nodded, and as they both got into the car, she let out another slow breath. The tension still lingered, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not in her mind. Not in Jonathan's. And maybe not in the minds of the people who had stood there and watched it all happen. As Jonathan started the car and pulled away from the curb, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had changed something. The question was, what happened next? As the city lights flickered past the car windows, Lisa stared out, her mind racing. The engine's soft hum should have been comforting, but the events of the past hour still clung to her, heavy and unshakable. Jonathan's grip on the steering wheel was firm. His jaw set in that way he had when he was deep in thought. He hadn't spoken much since they left the scene, but Lisa knew him well enough to recognize the storm brewing inside him. She shifted in her seat, exhaling slowly. "You're upset," she said, more of a statement than a question. Jonathan kept his eyes on the road, his fingers tightening slightly. "Of course I'm upset," he said, his voice even. "You were out running errands, minding your business, and suddenly 2 cops are ready to tow your car. All because someone, whoever they are, decided they didn't like seeing you with it." Lisa felt her stomach twist. That was the part that bothered her the most. Who had made that call? The officers never gave a name, never explained where the report came from. And yet, they had been confident enough to act on it without hesitation. "Who do you think it was?" she asked, turning to look at him. Jonathan let out a slow breath. "I don't know. But I intend to find out." She knew what that meant. Jonathan wasn't the kind of man to let things go easily, especially not something like this. His mind worked like clockwork, always planning, always putting pieces together. He wouldn't rest until he got answers. Lisa bit her lip, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her lap. "Do you think it was random?" Jonathan gave her a sideways glance. "You and I both know it wasn't." That sent a chill down her spine. She had considered it, of course, that maybe it was just a mistake, a case of bad luck. But deep down she didn't believe that. Someone had seen her, had taken it upon themselves to assume she didn't belong in that car, in that neighborhood, in that moment. The thought made her feel exposed, like a target had been placed on her back without her even realizing it. Jonathan pulled into their driveway, the automatic gate sliding open as he steered the car inside. Their home, a modern 2-story house with large windows and warm lighting, stood against the night sky like a quiet refuge. But as Lisa stepped out, a strange unease lingered. She followed Jonathan inside, locking the door behind them. He tossed his keys on the entryway table, then loosened his tie with a sharp pull. He was still tense, his movements precise, controlled. Lisa walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "Talk to me," she said softly. He let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "This wasn't random, Lisa. Someone called in that report, knowing exactly what it would lead to. The question is who?" Lisa's mind immediately jumped to the possibilities. The neighborhood was quiet, but it wasn't perfect. There were people who side-eyed them, who didn't always make them feel welcome. She had learned to brush it off over the years, but tonight it felt different. Felt personal. Then another thought crept in: work. Jonathan ran a successful real estate firm, and while he was well respected, he also had competitors. Some were friendly, others, not so much. And Lisa, an attorney, had made her fair share of enemies in court. She defended people who needed her, people who were often underestimated, ignored. She had won cases that others thought she had no business winning. Could this be retaliation? She looked up at Jonathan. What if it's someone from work? You or me? He considered it for a moment, then shook his head. If it was business-related, it wouldn't have been this subtle. This was someone trying to humiliate you, not send a message. Lisa nodded slowly, letting his words settle. He was right. This wasn't about business. This was about perception, about control. Someone had seen her, judged her, and made a decision in an instant. Jonathan walked over to the kitchen, grabbed a glass, and poured himself a drink. He took a slow sip before looking back at her. I'm going to make some calls tomorrow. See if I can pull any records, find out who made that report. Lisa hesitated. Do you think they'll tell you? He smirked slightly, the first hint of his usual confidence returning. They will if I ask the right people. She sighed, leaning against the counter. I just don't want this to turn into something bigger. Jonathan studied her for a moment. Lisa, it's already bigger. If we let this go, what's stopping it from happening again? To you, to someone else. She hated that he was right. The room fell into silence, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Then a soft ping. Lisa turned to her phone on the counter. Text message. Her brows furrowed as she picked it up. It was an unknown number. Be careful. This won't be the last time. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Jonathan noticed the shift in her expression immediately. What is it? She turned the screen toward him. His face darkened as he read the message. The unease that had been lingering all night suddenly sharpened into something more. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was something else. Something bigger. And it was only the beginning. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened as he read the message again. His eyes darkened, his jaw clenching just slightly, but Lisa could see the storm behind his expression. This wasn't just an empty threat. Someone was watching. Someone wanted them to know this wasn't over. Lisa swallowed hard, her fingers cold against the phone screen. Who would send this? She murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He exhaled slowly, then took his own phone from his pocket. I'm tracing this number, he said, already pulling up contacts. Lisa felt her stomach twist. She wanted answers just as badly as he did, but something about this was beginning to feel more dangerous than she had anticipated. A false police report was one thing, but a direct warning. That meant someone had planned this. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Jonathan stepped away, pacing toward his home office. His phone pressed to his ear. Lisa remained frozen in the kitchen, staring at the message again. The words burned into her mind. Be careful. This won't be the last time. The house felt different now. The warm lighting, the familiar space. It didn't feel as safe as it had earlier. She glanced toward the windows, suddenly aware of how open they were. Could someone be outside watching? Had someone followed her home? Her thoughts spiraled, but she forced herself to take a breath. Panicking wouldn't help. She needed to think. Jonathan returned a few minutes later. His expression unreadable. The number is a burner. Untraceable. Lisa's heart sank. Course. Whoever did this knew how to cover their tracks. Jonathan ran a hand over his face. This is calculated, Lisa. Someone didn't just see you and decide to make that call on impulse. They planned it. And now they want us to know they're not done. Lisa hugged her arms around herself. But why? What do they want? Jonathan's eyes flickered with something unreadable. I don't know. But I do know one thing, whoever they are, they're watching. And they expect us to be scared. Lisa took another breath, steadier this time. I won't give them that satisfaction. Jonathan's lips pressed together, a mix of pride and frustration in his expression. Good. But that doesn't mean we're going to let our guard down. Just then, another ping. Lisa nearly jumped. But this time it wasn't her phone, it was the security system. Jonathan pulled out his own device and checked the notification. His eyes narrowed. Motion detected, he muttered, scrolling through the footage. Lisa stepped closer, her breath catching as the screen showed a shadowed figure standing just beyond their gate. It was too dark to make out details, but the shape was clear. Someone was there. Watching. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it turned and walked away. Jonathan dropped his phone onto the counter. His expression unreadable. Lisa, he said slowly, this isn't over. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew he was right. Whoever was behind this wasn't finished. And the worst part, they had no idea what was coming next. Lisa and Jonathan stood in silence, their eyes still locked on the security footage. The shadowed figure had disappeared into the night, but the weight of its presence lingered. Lisa's mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Who was this person? Were they the same one who had called the cops on her earlier? Or was this something even bigger? Jonathan's fingers curled into a fist against the counter. He was always the calm one, the logical one, but Lisa could see the tight control he was holding over his emotions. That was what worried her the most. If Jonathan was rattled, then this was serious. The house felt different now. The walls seemed thinner, the windows too exposed. Lisa's skin prickled with the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. She took a step back, hugging her arms around herself, as if that would somehow shield her from whoever was lurking in the darkness outside. Jonathan grabbed his phone and made another call. His voice was low but firm. I need a security sweep. Cameras, sensors, everything. Tonight. Oz. I don't care how late it is. Get it done. Lisa swallowed hard. Jonathan, what if this isn't just about the car? Jonathan glanced at her. His expression unreadable. I've been thinking the same thing. Lisa hesitated, then lowered her voice. You don't think someone's trying to send a message, do you? Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, rubbing his fingers over his chin. I don't like coincidences, Lisa. And this is too precise to be random. A chill ran down her spine. She had spent years fighting cases, defending people who couldn't defend themselves. Jonathan had made powerful business moves, stepping into spaces where people didn't always welcome him. Either of them could have made the wrong enemy. But who? Her phone buzzed again, making her jump. Another message. You should have walked away. Her stomach dropped. She turned the screen toward Jonathan, her fingers trembling slightly. His face darkened as he read it, his jaw clenching. That's it, he said, grabbing his keys. We're not waiting for them to make the next move. We're going to find out exactly who's behind this. Lisa grabbed his arm. Jonathan, wait. Where are you going? He turned to her, his voice sharp but controlled. To get answers. Lisa's heart pounded. And what if they're expecting that? What if that's exactly what they want? Jonathan hesitated, his eyes scanning hers. She could see the internal battle. His instinct to protect her clashing with the logical part of him that knew she was right. Then, before either of them could say another word, a loud knock echoed through the house. Lisa froze. Jonathan turned slowly, his body immediately tense. The knock came again, harder this time. Lisa glanced at the security monitor, her breath catching in her throat. Police officer stood at the door. But something felt off. Jonathan moved toward the door, but Lisa grabbed his wrist, shaking her head. Wait. She looked back at the screen. The officer's stance was rigid, his face partially shadowed. But it wasn't just that. Something about the uniform felt wrong. Jonathan noticed it too. His eyes narrowed. Then, before either of them could react, the officer turned his head slightly, just enough for the light to catch his face. Lisa's breath hitched. It was one of the officers from earlier that day. The same one who had tried to take her car. Only now he wasn't just standing outside. He was here. And he wasn't alone. Jonathan's entire body tensed as he stared at the screen. Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat, her pulse pounding. The officer from earlier was standing at their door. His posture stiff, unreadable. But it wasn't just him. There was another figure standing just out of view, half hidden in the shadows beyond the porch light. Lisa's fingers tightened around Jonathan's arm. Something's wrong, she whispered. Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on the screen. I see it. The knock came again, louder, more forceful this time. Neither of them moved. Jonathan finally took a slow step toward the door, but Lisa reached for his hand. "Don't open it." Jonathan hesitated. He was a man who faced problems head-on, but Lisa knew his instincts were telling him the same thing. This wasn't a routine visit. Something else was at play. Then, the officer spoke from the other side of the door. His voice was calm, but there was something off about it. "Mr. Carter. Mrs. Carter. We need to speak with you. It's important." Jonathan exhaled slowly, his mind working fast. He pulled out his phone and, without a word, sent a quick text. "Backup." He wasn't taking any chances. Lisa's heart was racing now. "What do they want?" she murmured. Jonathan didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward the security monitor again. The second figure had stepped forward just enough for the porch light to catch his face. Lisa inhaled sharply. It wasn't another officer. It was a man in plain clothes, middle-aged, sharp eyes, an expression that sent chills through her. She didn't recognize him, but something about him felt calculated. Jonathan's jaw clenched. "We're not opening that door," he said quietly. Before Lisa could respond, the doorknob rattled. Someone was testing it. Jonathan's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, his entire body going rigid. Then, as if sensing they weren't going to answer, the officer outside let out a slow breath. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said. "I'd really suggest you open up." Lisa's skin prickled. This wasn't right. No officer would say that, not like this. Jonathan took a single step closer to the door. "And if we don't?" he asked, his voice dangerously steady. Then the officer sighed. "That's unfortunate." The next second everything happened at once. A sharp sound. Metal scraping against metal. Tool. Lisa's mind barely had time to process it before Jonathan moved fast, grabbing her wrist and pulling her back just as the front lock gave a sharp, forced click. Someone was trying to break in. Lisa gasped, panic flashing through her. Jonathan was already moving, grabbing the remote for the security system. A sharp beep filled the air as he hit the emergency lockdown. The house responded instantly. Metal shutters descending over the windows, doors sealing automatically. Jonathan had installed the system years ago, but this was the first time they had ever needed it. Outside there was movement. The officer and the mystery man exchanged quick words before stepping back. A second later they were gone. Lisa and Jonathan stood frozen, waiting, listening. The security cameras tracked them moving down the driveway, disappearing into the dark. Lisa exhaled, her whole body trembling. "Jonathan, what just happened?" Jonathan was already on the phone. His voice clipped. "We need patrol units at my house now. And I want a name. I want to know who that man was." Lisa swallowed hard, her mind still spinning. And then, just when she thought the worst was over, her phone buzzed again. Another message. "This isn't over. You should have taken the warning." Lisa stared at the screen, a chill running through her veins. Whoever was behind this. They weren't done. And now, they knew exactly where to find them. Lisa's fingers trembled as she stared at the message on her phone. The words felt like a warning and a promise all at once. Jonathan was still on the phone, his voice low but sharp, giving orders to someone on the other end. His usual controlled demeanor had cracked just slightly, enough for Lisa to see how serious this was. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Jonathan, what if they come back?" Jonathan ended his call and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "They won't get the chance." Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 patrol cars pulled into their driveway, red and blue lights flashing against the dark night. Lisa felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of what had just happened. An officer stepped out, this time a different one, someone Lisa and Jonathan hadn't seen before. He was older, with a calm but firm presence. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter," he greeted them. "We got your call. You want to tell us exactly what happened here tonight." Jonathan nodded and led the officer inside, recounting everything, From the false police report earlier in the day to the threatening messages and finally, to the attempted break-in. The officer listened carefully, jotting down notes, his expression hardening as the story unfolded. Lisa sat on the couch, still gripping her phone, replaying the message over and over in her head. "Do you think they were real cops?" she asked, looking up. The officer exhaled, shaking his head. "One of them was. But based on what you're saying, he was acting way outside his authority. The other man. We'll need to run facial recognition on the security footage. But I'd bet he's not with the department at all." Lisa's stomach turned. "So, this wasn't just a misunderstanding." "No," the officer said grimly. "This was intentional." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Do you have any idea who might be behind it?" The officer hesitated. "Off the record. Sounds like someone with connections. Someone who thought they could intimidate you into backing down from something." He looked between them. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter. Have either of you been involved in anything lately that might have made powerful enemies?" Lisa and Jonathan exchanged a glance. Lisa was a lawyer, one who had fought against corrupt practices and exposed hidden wrongs. Jonathan was a businessman, one who had stepped into spaces where some people didn't think he belonged. Either of them could have made the wrong person angry. Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't have proof, but there was a deal I backed out of recently. Some people weren't happy about it." Lisa nodded slowly. "And I was working on a case that got dismissed under suspicious circumstances. The opposing counsel wasn't exactly thrilled with me." The officer took this in, nodding. "We'll look into both angles." He glanced at the security system. "For now, keep your house locked down. If they were bold enough to try this once, they might try again in a different way." Lisa shivered. The idea of someone watching them, waiting for another chance, made her skin crawl. The officers took their statements, retrieved the security footage, and assured them they would be patrolling the area for the next few nights. But even after they left, the unease in the house remained. Jonathan sat beside Lisa on the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. "We're getting a private investigator," he muttered. "Someone who can dig deeper, faster." Lisa nodded. "And we're upgrading the security again." They were both exhausted, but neither of them moved. The night felt heavier, as if the walls around them weren't as strong as they once seemed. Lisa looked at Jonathan. "What if they don't stop?" Jonathan met her gaze, his expression serious. "Then we don't stop either." Days passed, then a week. The investigation moved quickly. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The officer who had shown up at their door wasn't acting alone. He had ties to a private security firm, one that had been used in questionable deals before. The man in plain clothes. He was linked to a high-profile businessman who had been on the losing end of one of Jonathan's deals. Someone who wasn't used to hearing no. Lisa's case. The dismissed charges. That same businessman had connections to the law firm on the other side. It had all been connected. The false police report, the messages, the intimidation. Someone had wanted to scare them into silence, into backing down. But they had underestimated them. With the evidence collected, the authorities moved in. The officer involved was suspended, facing charges for misconduct. The businessman. He found himself in legal trouble of his own. The case Lisa had been working on was reopened, this time under a much closer eye. And just like that, the threat stopped. Lisa and Jonathan finally exhaled, though the weight of the past weeks still lingered. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Lisa turned to Jonathan. "Do you think they'll ever try again?" Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head. "Not like this. They know now that we won't back down." Lisa nodded, letting out a slow breath. "Good." The night was quiet. No strange figures outside. No ominous messages. Just the hum of the city in the distance. The warmth of Jonathan's hand in hers. They had faced the storm. And they had won. But most importantly, they had faced it together.